he could actually bring reform to help us regular folks out, especially after that Ben Harrison, 1888 to 1892 administration, in which we have pensions go crazy. We have a $1 billion Congress, and we have the Sherman Antitrust Act, which really wasn't. We have the Sherman Silver Purchase, which really wasn't. And we have the McKinley Tariff, which jacks tariff rates up all over the place. Republicans in the ascendancy in 1888, 1892. Now the Democrats can come into power, and we can really do some good for the average person in America, or maybe not. And the first strike is indeed the tariff. Remember, tariffs protect infant industries. Well, we don't have infant industries by 1892, and thus the good Democrat will walk into the Congress and say, we need a lower tariff. And proposed by Grover Cleveland, the good Democrat, is a lower tariff. But if we saw that picture of the United States Senate controlled by the monopolists, and we see a president potentially not with the most power and ability we've ever seen as far as getting legislation accomplished, being from New York, being an outsider. Grover Cleveland's tariff proposals get manhandled, get manipulated, get massaged by the corporate interests in Congress. And instead of a tariff reduction, the tariff called the Wilson-Gorman tariff of 1893 is actually an increase in tariff rates. Now, there is an income tax that's instituted for the first time in American history with the Wilson-Gorman tariff, but it's struck down within a year or two by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. More about that later. But the Democratic attempt to bring tariff rates down, kaput, gone, no good. Strike one, Grover Cleveland. Strike two is the fact that the Sherman Silver Purchase Act that was supposed to inflate actually has done the opposite. Because in 1893, what happens? Economic downturn. Remember, cyclical boom and bust cycles in American history. 1893, bam, we have a 4-year-long extraordinary depression. And that extraordinary depression will hammer us economically. And it's not good because we certainly aren't inflating at that point in time. Remember, the Sherman Silver Purchase Act requires that a certain amount of silver be coined, purchased and coined by the federal government, but not nearly enough to actually increase the amount of currency, coin, flowing into the American economy. And it contained that crucial, awful provision that you have to give silver miners gold. Now, to have about $350 million worth of currency out there, you need $100 million of gold sitting in Fort Knox for the American people to have as bolstering their economy. Well, guess what happens? In 1893, depression hits. Are you going to have a dollar bill sitting in your house? Or are you going to use the gold standard to go get real gold for that dollar bill? And in 1893 into 1894, what happens to the American government gold reserves? They're dwindling. And 100 million is hit. And as I mentioned before, it goes down to 90, 80, 70, 60, 50. We're down within 2 years of the start of the Depression to about $40 million worth of actual gold sitting in our reserves. What are you going to do then? Well, what you're going to do then is send the richest man in America to Europe. And you're going to give him dollar bills straight from the U.S. Treasury. And we send J.P. Morgan to Europe with U.S. dollar bills. And he, because of his connections, background, and gravitas as a financier, or as Mr. Kennedy would say, a filigree-fingered financier. And he goes to Europe and he buys $70 million worth of actual gold to put into the reserves. Great idea. Well, we also repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. Well, what are you doing? Grover, not only is the tariff going up, but you're repealing the act that actually inflates the currency because you're losing too much gold. Good idea. And then You send J.P. Morgan over to Europe to buy gold? Well, okay, we bolster our gold reserves. We don't flounder as a country. But guess who gets paid $7 million personal profit for going to Europe and doing these deeds? J.P. Morgan, the richest guy in America. So Grover, step number 2 on tariff policy, ain't doing reform. On monetary policy, you ain't doing reform. Well, how about on labor relations? Are you doing reform there? No. The Pullman strike, as you read this evening, is an extraordinary event in American history. Remember, Depression, and if you are running a company town and you're paying 100, like Lowell, remember, company town like Lowell, you're paying $100 a month to your employees, 70% of that is in rent, 20% of that is in utilities, and 10% is left over for food and room and all that stuff. Well, guess what happens to the salary? It's cut by 25%. And so the employee now has only $75 in economic crisis. I can't pay my rent. I can't pay my utilities. The Pullman Palace Car Company, as we know, making the beautiful Palace cars, says, tough luck. Go work someplace else. And the Pullman Palace Car Company workers say, we have to strike. And we have to get help from the American Railway Workers. Now that American Railway Workers is led by a guy named Eugene V. Debs. And Debs goes, I'm one of the best men around as far as union work. We cannot strike. We cannot win the strike. And the American Railway Workers say, we have to strike. We have to support the Pullman group. Well, the strike is happened. The strike is successful. The strike is shutting down the railroads all across the United States, especially in that hub of Chicago. The Chicago governor is petitioned by the corporate interests of the railroad saying, you have to stop the strike. And the governor of Chicago says, the governor of Illinois says, I'm not going to do that. Who steps in to protect the integrity of the American railway system and to make sure things are shipped because the strike is so successful? Grover Cleveland. How can the federal government intrude on the labor management situation all across the country? There's such a thing as an injunction. And you can seek and get specific action legally. If you can go into a court and say, these individuals are in violation of this law, please, judge, issue an injunction to stop them from breaking that law. That is a concept in the American law, and it's called an injunction. We often refer to it as a restraining order, where a judge orders somebody to act in a certain manner. Well, that was what happened in 1894. And in 1894, the federal government walks into federal court and says, workers, go back to work. You're in violation of federal law. And the workers go, but, and the federal government sends out bayonets and soldiers and says, get back to work or else you're in violation of federal law. Strike broken. Grover Cleveland helping the worker out? No. That's strike 3. Debs in jail. He'll go to jail rather than stop the strike. Incredible moment in American labor history where the workers are pulverized, pounded, decimated by the federal government by this injunction because they're in violation of federal law and the strike is broken. Grover Cleveland, you're out of there, bringing to fruition the opportunity for the People's Party, the Populist Party, to come forward in the next presidential election. Oh wait, by the way, what was that federal law that the American Railway Workers and the Pullman workers were in violation of? What would it be that you would be violating that allow a federal court to say, you got to go back to work because you're in violation of this federal law? What might that federal law be? Oh yeah, they're in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act because they're combining to restrain trade. Wow, really? The only time it gets used is against workers and labor unions? That's rich. That's good. That's the Gilded Age of politics. That's the plight of the farmer. That's the step before we go into the populist party and William Jennings Bryan and all that. And we'll see you tomorrow.